We're now into the final portion of lessons for the section on mixing. And this is really the home stretch where we get into the actual tools and techniques that you're going to be applying in the mixing stage. And that's really important because we're focused specifically on mixing, not on production. So, a big chunk of this, and something to always keep in mind, is how am I using these tools differently in the mixing stage as to how I use them in the production stage? And the answer to that is really simple. It's just context. When you're mixing music, you're thinking about how the parts are really related to one another in terms of their quality, their sound, their timbre, whatever word you want to use. And during production, you're normally thinking about each of these parts in more musical terms and also one by one. So you think, okay, here's how I want the piano to sound. Good, got that. Here's how I want the bass to sound. Good, got that. But you're not thinking so much about how they're blending together, how they're going to come together cohesively. And that's really the whole point of mixing. We're going to kick this off by talking about filters and EQ. Really, they're one in the same, but nowadays we kind of differentiate them because we think of filters as high pass and low pass and, maybe a band pass, mainly because of, I think, how prominent synthesizers are in the modern production. So we really look at filters and EQ slightly differently, but EQ and all the different shapes you have are really just a bunch of different filters being used together. So let's go ahead, jump in here and talk about the functions of EQ in the mix. I was able to boil this down to three pretty basic functions, all of which we will be talking about in subsequent lessons. So the first function I have here is fix it. So fix it would mean, let's say that you have a recording and the recording is less than stellar. It's kind of picked up some of the problems. Maybe, for example, a truck drove by. It was something you didn't notice at the time, but when you play back and listen, you're getting this like low end rumble that you don't need. So you might go in and high pass that to get rid of it, just because it's something that's not really adding any dimension to the recording that you try to get. Maybe there's some kind of excessive tape hiss that you're able to handle. Maybe there's like a room mode or some kind of resonant frequency that keeps peaking out that you want to pull down on. Those are all examples of fix it. And really, these are probably all going to be taken care of during the production because it can be really annoying to have something continually sticking out again and again, and you go in and you address it at that time. Also, with high quality samples and also electronic instruments, both hardware and software, we don't normally have to worry about fix it applications because that's already been taken into account. So when you pull up a software synthesizer, it's not really going to maybe exhibit some of the same traits that you might expect from a real instrument, so to speak, and having to record a real instrument and the complications of that. It's just different. And same thing with samples. They probably were recorded at some point, but in order to sell these samples, they want to make them as loud and as exciting as possible. They've already gone in and processed them and have probably taken care of the fix-it element for you. And this is really important because I see a lot of people, and it's a common it's not a mistake people make, it's just a common technique of going in and high passing everything. Well, that's fine if you're also going to apply additional EQ, but there's no need to add a high pass filter if there isn't something already there. The second function we have here for EQ in the mix is to enhance it. And enhance it doesn't just mean adding boost. It can also be adding cuts because this is now enhancing something relative to other parts. So you're listening to this and you're probably listening to it in a different light than the producer has listened. And so you might listen back and think, oh my gosh, this piano, it's way too bright in relation to the guitar. So I'm going to completely change the tonality on this piano. I'm going to add some really drastic cuts in here. Okay, now I feel like it's fitting better, and therefore I've enhanced both parts. So enhance it similar to what you might be doing in production, only now you're listening to this with a fresh set of ears and thinking about how everything is going to work together. You might agree with the producer's decisions. You might disagree with them, and this would be an application for EQ. Finally, we have blend it, and I wrote here sacrificing for clarity's sake, and I mean clarity on the whole. So sometimes you'll have a piano or any instrument. I don't know why I'm going with piano, but sometimes you'll have a piano and it sounds really, really nice, but it's actually getting in the way of the vocal. So you have to ask yourself, what is more important, the vocal or the piano? And upon answering that question, you EQ accordingly, and you do so usually pretty subtly because you're just trying to blend these together. You don't want frequencies masking each other. You don't want parts stepping on each other. You want everything to have its own unique place in the frequency spectrum, and that's where EQ comes in. And here's where a lot of really subtle moves adds up to, a more cohesive whole at the end. And as I already stated, we'll be looking at hypothetical examples of all of these in the following lessons. So before going any further, just want to point this out straight up. Of all the effects we have access to in both production and also in mixing, EQ is probably the easiest to not only understand, but also to hear and finally to use, right? It's pretty straightforward. You drop an EQ on, you drastically throw a bell on there, and you hear what it's done. Okay, you might like the effect, you might not like the effect, but it's very intuitive and straightforward. We will be going into some specifics and some that may seem a little bit complex to you right now, but fundamentally EQ is an intuitive process and you don't need to understand the inner workings of an EQ to effectively use it. Ultimately, your ears should be the guide, so don't put an EQ on unless you hear a reason to do so, and those reasons are as follows: fix it, enhance it, blend it. Okay, so pretty straightforward, easy to understand. As you get more and more deep into mixing and you start to mix different styles of music, you'll understand why the complexity and nuance and subtleties are more important. But for now, we don't have to worry about that too much. However, we will get into a little bit of the basics. So what are some limitations of EQ? We know EQ is very popular, but it can't solve all the problems. And here are the two limitations that I can think of. Number one, you can't add or take away what isn't there. So again, if you want to make a sound a lot brighter, but there really are just no frequencies up there to start with, there's nothing you can do with an EQ to fix that. You can try to make a huge boost or a huge gain, and maybe it will bring up the air of the recording somewhat, but let's say that sample has already been filtered. That EQ isn't really going to get what you want, all right? So you always have to make sure, either by using your ear or a frequency analyzer, if you're more of a beginner, that you're actually adding a boost or a cut to frequencies that exist in the signal. And the second limitation, and the big limitation in modern music, is that EQ is a static effect. So as a static effect, what we really mean is that the EQ is not responding to the signal in any way as it's playing back in real time. So there's no regard for dynamic, there's no regard for pitch. So as something gets louder, the EQ isn't going to adjust suddenly. And as something goes up and down in pitch, the EQ band isn't going to move along with it. And that's really important, and one of the reasons why we don't turn to EQ as much as maybe you think we would. Because if you have a part and it's playing in various octaves and you're trying to boost the fundamentals, how can you do that evenly with an EQ? And the answer is you simply can't, because that EQ is just sitting there at 200 hertz, whether you play something that's 400 hertz, 600 hertz, or 200 hertz. So for this reason, you really have to think about when EQ is and isn't appropriate for what you're looking to do. And that's why I try to break it down into those three basic functions, because those three basic functions are when EQ really is appropriate. So a bell curve with a sharp Q and judicious gain on an instrument playing a varied melodic line is not going to enhance the overall tone of the instrument. It might just make a few of those fundamentals stick out more. If that's what you want, that's fine, but typically that's not the goal here. We're trying to change the overall tonality, so we'd want some kind of really broad curve that's going to get all of those fundamental frequencies. Okay. And also, if a certain frequency is only loud momentarily, so like a room resonance, for example, when somebody hits a particular note and you use EQ to solve that problem, you're actually dulling that frequency for the entire part, not just that moment when it's really peaking out. So this is why in modern mixes, you see people going to dynamic EQs or using multi-band compressors, because those are actually going to restore the general tonality of the sound for the majority of the part and only clamp down when that frequency becomes unruly. So let's get into EQ hype a little bit, because it's a big thing. I mean, trust me, there are so many EQ options out there, and EQ does play a major role in most modern mixes, but as a static processor and as a static effect, it's honestly quite limited in many contemporary situations you're going to find yourself in when you're mixing. So an obvious question you might have then is, why are there so many EQ options? And really, there are hundreds of EQ plugins out there, not only the ones that come bundled in your DAW, but from third parties, all sorts of options that you have. And all EQs do sound different, but I want to make it clear that higher cost here absolutely does not equal better quality. This is another one of those, it's a subjective taste thing. You might prefer the way one EQ works to another, but it probably doesn't have anything to do with cost. I do not adhere to the you get what you pay for in the EQ plugin market. There are expensive EQs that I like, and then there are inexpensive or freeware EQs that I like just as much, usually for different reasons. And this is where we start getting into the more complex kind of subjective nature of the various EQ options that you have. EQ is easy to understand, and it's relatively easy to design. Both analog and digital. Now, I wrote relatively easy because I certainly couldn't do it, but in terms of actual design, engineering, and even for like DSP, putting it into code, EQ is not that difficult and has a very long history in audio engineering. And it was one of the first processors that people really requested and one of the first processors that readily became available. So there's been plenty of time to develop and to evolutionize the EQ as it exists in both an analog hardware domain and also in a software digital domain. And for that reason, it's no surprise that many designs have been put forth, all somewhat different from one another, but in a way, all fundamentally the same, because we're talking about controlling the frequency content of any given signal. Personally, and so this is just a personal opinion, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, as somebody who isn't a mix engineer and who maybe doesn't pick up on the nuances and subtleties quite as much as somebody who does mix every day, most of the time I prefer the EQ that actually just comes bundled with my DAW, mainly because I think it's what I'm used to hearing. And I've never really spent a lot of time working with analog EQs or on a console, so I'm most familiar with digital EQ, both the scheme, how it goes about enhancing or cutting sounds, and also the sound of it. So ultimately, what's important? How is it sounding when I boost? How does it sound when I cut? And again, this is just because I have a lot of experience working with the digital EQs. And if you listen to a lot of modern music, popular music, you'll also probably start to realize that the EQs that they're using a lot of times are just the basic digital EQs that might come bundled with the DAW because that's what you're familiar with. That's what's easiest for you to pull to. And that's where you have the expectation of the resulting sound. So EQ really is basically just a bunch of complex filter designs. And all of these filter designs can be different, which leads to sound variation, which is what we're going to be focusing on next. So what are the major differences of EQ? And I've already given away one of these. For this course, we're going to put these differences down to two things. Number one is shape, okay? The shape of the filters, the shape of the bells, the shape of the shelves can all be different and all really are different. And we'll look at examples here coming up if you want a visual representation as well. And then also amplification. This is a big one. So how exactly does the EQ go about boosting or cutting frequencies? Is the EQ divided up into different bands, each of which having a separate amplifier? Or is the EQ more of a passive design where the only way you make something louder is to just put everything else relative to it quieter, in which case then you need some kind of amplifier at the end to bring the sound back up so that you actually then get that proper gain staging, right? So the before and after sound the same. And with amplification, we start to talk about saturation, which is another word for distortion. So when the EQ processes the sound in any way, or even just to bring the volume up at the end, are we adding new characteristics? Are we adding additional harmonics, things that weren't there to begin with? So let's kick it off by talking about shape. So we have filters, shelves, bells, all of which can vary in shape. We have sometimes static versus adaptive cue. This might also be the resonance control. How broad or narrow is the slope? And so again, we'll look at examples of this, but in some EQ designs, as you actually have more boost, the cue starts to sharpen up. Just by the design. You're not in control of that, but we also then have a user-defined Q. So we could actually have this be a variable thing that we set ourselves. So if we want to add just 1 dB but make it incredibly sharp, we could do that. Or if we want to add 10 dBs and make it very wide, we could do that as well. That's one of the real advantages, I think, to digital, the ease of being able to put that in, where an analog that requires a lot of moving parts and can be somewhat expensive. So here's our baseline for the various examples we're going to look at. It's just some pink noise going through the Voxengo span. And this is going to allow us to look at these different shapes and see the differences, because you'll be able to hear them, but also just to kind of get my point across, I want you to see these things visually. Okay, so here's our first shape variation. We're on what's called the American model, and we've added 15 dB at 2.5 hertz. That's all we've done, and you can see the shape of it like so. If we move on now to the Soviet model, exactly the same settings, but a different shape. So you can see on this one, the Q control, which you don't have control over as a user, is actually quite broad in comparison. Okay, so this one's a little bit sharper, this one's a little bit broader. And with variation number 3, we go to a different EQ, and in this one, I'm going to have to look and try to find where exactly the gain has happened. If you look on the middle module, you can see that the boost that's more towards the middle is up 10, and that's happening here at 3K, so 3000 hertz, similar to the 2.5, just up an additional 500, but we're really focused here on the shape, and you can see the differences between all three. Okay, like so, pretty straightforward and easy to see. If we talk about varied slope, or a Q, this is just one example of that because this program has it built in, so you're not able to adjust it. But if you look here, we're at 2.5K, and we've increased by 5 dB, and you can see just how broad this slope is. But look at what happens when we increase this to 18 dB. It really sharpens out. And if there wasn't a variable Q here, you would see something like this image only raised, amplified by quite a bit. So this is an example of a varied slope Q design built into an equalizer. All right, so those are the differences in shape, like so. Easy to see, but you really need to make sure you're using your ear to hear the differences there. Now on to amplification. And the goal is not to get too technical in this course or in this presentation, but sometimes it's hard not to. So when we're talking about amplification, we're really asking, how does the EQ work? And more specifically, how does the EQ more or less really boost is the key here, but also cut frequencies because they are related. Does the EQ add something that isn't there to begin with? Like I said, that's saturation. And then what exactly is the model of the EQ? Is it digital? Is it analog? Or is it hybrid? And here we're speaking specifically about plugins and software design. So within the software design of an EQ, you could try to model what was done in the analog domain, and a lot of EQs do that. Or you can try to make something digital, as pristine and clean as possible. Actually, if we're going to get really technical, this also involves phase considerations, but we're not going there for now. We're really just thinking about saturation. So with a digital design, you're not going to have any kind of saturation at all, or you could have some kind of hybrid EQ, which is what we have with this TDR Vox Slick EQ. All right, this is definitely a hybrid design, and we'll talk about what that means here as we move forward with amplification. And then the other question is digital just harsh, right? That's a common sentiment that we hear, that digital EQ is just way too harsh. It doesn't have the richness or the vibrance of analog. Or is digital just really precise and therefore should be used because we're not adding anything new? It's just straight digital. That's a decision that I leave up to you. I'm not going to weigh in on that debate because, again, I think it comes down to personal taste and what you're used to working with. And again, I'm used to working with digital EQs, and I like the sound of them, but some people don't. And, that's something that you'll decide for yourself. So in this example here, we're looking at an amplifier gain stage. So this is where we would bring in the potential saturation. And here you can see that we have these different tube models we can choose from. If we turn this amplifier gain stage off, This EQ is then essentially just a digital EQ. It's not adding in any saturation, but it is giving you those unique filter shapes and types that are related to the hardware version of this plugin emulation. And if you are going with an amplifier gain stage, you then have to start thinking about the input, which you can see on the bottom left, and the output. You have to drive in if you want to add additional saturation. So in this case, the EQ itself is not going to be adding any additional saturation or harmonics unless you engage the different tube models and assuming that you have enough input to actually maybe overdrive it a little bit. And here we have what's I would call more of the hybrid design, where we have an amp applied on the boost, assuming that we have the saturation turned on, something that we didn't see before, and then we choose one of these different output stages. And you can see we have the options of linear, silky, mellow, deep, funky, all of which are going to add in some way or another saturation, but it only does so on boosts. So that's really interesting. You have to make sure that you have a boost on either a shelf or a bell in order to get any saturation. And that kind of goes back to the analog days of having individual amplifiers for each band of the EQ. And so if you're cutting, it doesn't really matter because you're not having to use or engage the amplifier. But if you're boosting, you will, and then that's going to add the saturation. So what will make this easier to understand is to, again, look at some examples here. Here's our baseline. It's just a sine wave at 500 hertz. All right. And any boost that we apply, we're going to do at 500 hertz. Remember that you can't add something that isn't there. So this will really show us the saturation and added harmonics. So a first example is a digital one, and you can see down the bottom left, we have our digital EQ that comes bundled with the program. I've put a pretty judicious gain on here of, I believe it looks like 13 decibels, and I've had to compensate the output accordingly, but you can see that nothing new has been popped up in our spectrum here. So this is essentially a digital EQ. We're not adding any saturation, any harmonics. It just is what it is. So this is where, digital, very precise. It does what you tell it to do. It's not going to give you anything more than what's expected. And with the TDR slick EQ, we can see that the same thing occurs when the saturation is turned off. So if we don't have the saturation button engaged, even if we're applying a very nice big boost here, you can see at 497 hertz, 12 dB boost, nothing is really going on, nothing is happening, nothing new has been brought up into the spectrum. However, when we turn the saturation on and we apply that boost of 12 dB, so nothing has changed except the saturation has been turned on and we've calibrated it. The higher the calibration setting, the more saturation you're going to get. And you can see that on funky mode, we add all of these additional harmonics into the signal. Now, this is extreme because we're adding 12 decibels and calibrating really high. If you have a complex audio waveform going through here, you're not going to want to push it this hard. You really want this effect to be subtle. But this is just so you can see that we are adding something new. And on the funky version, it adds quite a bit, as compared to on the mellow version where the harmonics and what's added is a little bit different. And the actual structure of these harmonics is something that was decided upon by the software developer. So I don't think they were necessarily trying to emulate any specific analog amplifiers. I think they just came up with their own home brews that they thought sounded cool. And that's a really interesting concept and idea to look into because you don't have to keep it, specifically to the past. You can have your own algorithms that generate additional harmonics or saturation based on what you like the sound of. And you don't have to know the details. It's really about using your ear, but just so you can see the difference here, exact same settings, different flavors, different harmonics that are added in. And if you even look at the TDR Nova here, okay, you would think that this would be an incredibly precise digital EQ. But as you look at this here, it actually appears to be adding on maybe even ordered harmonics, not 100% sure, very subtle, requires a hard push, but it shows that even in a plugin like the Nova that we look at and assume to be very digital, there are those analog ideas and saturation coming into play here with the software. And on to the other EQ here. And what I've done here is I've added a big boost again, which you can see from the top left at 500 hertz, which is where the sine wave is located, with the tube section turned off. And unfortunately, I didn't do the best job. I should have pulled this down lower, but nothing new has been added here when the tubes are off. And this is really interesting because this is actually emulating a hardware device, but without that additional amplification stage at the end, we're not seeing any saturation. It's basically just a digital EQ with unique filter shapes, which was one of our, as we saw before, characteristics of different EQs. So now if we go and we have no EQ, so unfortunately, I did a terrible job with this picture, but if I was to bring it over, you can still see there's a 10 dB boost, but I've actually turned off the EQ because you can go in here and you see where it says in. If you turn that off, it means the EQ is not working. So I actually did go in and I turned that off, but I now have a different tube setting. And so with these tubes, you can see that they preface even ordered harmonics, typically what people refer to as a very rich, warm musical sound, but again, use your own ears, make your own decisions and determinations. But we can see here the difference with different tube settings. So this one says 83, this one says 88. I guess it's a more modern tube design. And you can see that it's not adding quite as much. And if you look down at the output, you can see that I have it turned all the way down. So the only way I could actually generate the additional harmonics was to drive it in with the input. So we think back to all the times we've talked about gain staging. Here is exactly an application where it applies. If you don't have the input driving in hard enough, you're not going to get any additional saturation, and maybe you don't want it. So it's not like you want it every single time, but if you do, you're going to have to work and adjust the gain staging accordingly and use your ears. So once again, we come back to these functions. Fix it, enhance it, blend it. But now after looking at the saturation, there might be an additional fourth function, and it may or may not be called color it. But based on what we've talked about, I think you'll be able to speculate and apply that with your mixes and with the EQs that maybe you ultimately end up purchasing. Fundamentally, EQ does the same thing. Not difficult, pretty straightforward. And in the next few videos, we will look at the various applications of EQ and its functions to give you just a few ideas when you're in there in the mix with 50 tracks and everything is jumbled on top of each other. Thanks for your attention. And up next, we're going to get into fix-it functions.